Welcome to all of you. A very warm welcome indeed to what I hope will prove to be a very special evening. Here we are in gloriously sunny Oxford. It's not always typical of this month here, but it has been wonderful. And I hope you're going to have a wonderful evening with us. This is our inaugural Lady Ademola lecture, and it follows on from our event in March last year when the Vice-Chancellor of the University unveiled a portrait of Lady Ademola, and Pamela Roberts gave us a wonderful talk about the history of Black Oxford. This lecture is named for Kofarola Ademola Moore, who arrived at St Hugh's College back in 1932 to study English. She became the first Black woman, Black African woman, I should say, to achieve a degree in Oxford in 1935. Lady Ademola, as she was to become, was a lifelong advocate for women's education and social reform and did tremendously fabulous things in Africa, and indeed returned here in 1986 to visit this college, when I'm pleased to say that she's talked very warmly about her experience here, when it must have been something of a traumatic experience coming here as a first in anything, particularly at that time. The new annual lecture is part of a larger project named for Lady Ademola, established in 2020 to support Black graduate students and visiting scholars from Africa. Our Lady Ademola Fund is central to the college's efforts to encourage greater participation and representation here from Africa. Our fund will finance a Lady Ademola scholarship administered in association with the Oxford Africa Initiative, and this will further fund a master's student from Africa to study here. And we're delighted to report that the first recipient of this scholarship will be arriving in the autumn. The fund will also establish the AFOX visiting fellows, who will be fellows coming from Africa to join us for a year or shorter periods indeed, and to be able to share in the experience and discussions with our African specialists here at St Hugh's. So very much look forward to that experience. Thank you. Can I thank, in fact, all of you who have already contributed towards this fund, and indeed many of you have contributed very generously while registering for this fund this evening. Our speaker this evening is a very special woman to produce the inaugural lecture. Professor Ross is a highly esteemed associate professor at Smith College in Northampton, USA, Massachusetts, in the program for the study of women and gender. She teaches courses on white supremacy, human rights, and calling out culture. She serves as a consultant for Smith College, collecting oral histories of feminists of colour for the Sophia Smith collection, which also contains her personal archives. Professor Ross's lecture this evening is entitled Appropriate Whiteness. It is based on Professor Ross's experience doing anti-Klan and anti-white supremacy organising. The lecture addresses situations of racial awkwardness and fears of messing up. It helps normalise discussions of race with a frank analysis of what to do and not to do in moving forward dialogues. Just before I start, may I also introduce to you Professor David Taylor, who is our Tutor for Equality and Diversity and a Fellow in English Literature. He will be chairing the Q&As after the lecture. And it's now my great delight to hand you over to Professor Loretta Ross.
Thank you for that warm introduction. Hopefully you can hear me. Thank you. It is my honor to have a chance to speak to you this evening. I will be using a PowerPoint, and we will be following up with the Q&A discussion afterwards so that you can ask questions of me. I've combined a couple of topics in my presentation because I wanted to talk about my anti-fascist work as a platform for talking about how we do the work better together to beat back fascism and white supremacy. So I'm going to go to my PowerPoint now and run through it rather quickly. Hopefully you can see the screen. And we shall go on and get forward. My nickname is Dread Feminist, but you don't have to pay attention to that. But as you can see, I'm a feminist with dreadlocks, but I spell it dread because of a very famous Dred Scott case here in the States that declared that Black people were 3/5 of a human being. So I always want to call into the conversation that legal decision That, of course, was dreadful. I am a member of the human rights movement. That is the framework with which I do my work, my political activism, as well as my academic scholarship. But because I've been a lifelong feminist, I'm part of the women's rights wing of the human rights movement, and I care about racial justice. So I'm part of the civil rights wing of the human rights movement, and I'm disabled, so I'm part of the disability rights wing. I don't have enough space to put all the arrows I'd like to put up there, but I want you to use this kind of graph to locate how we are all part of the same human rights movement, yet we may focus on different aspects of that movement in order to realize our purpose and mission. I also want to bring into the conversation a famous activist, Grace Lee Boggs, who recently died in 2015, who talks about how you cannot change any society unless you take responsibility for it, unless you see yourself as belonging to it and responsible for changing it. And that is the moment that we're at this time in history, that there are some rapid changing globally, and we have to take responsibility for changing the society and changing it towards building a global human rights culture. And this requires challenging fascism and white supremacy. As you heard from my introduction, I've done anti-fascist work since the 1990s, and there's many dimensions to challenging fascism and white supremacy. First, we have to challenge it morally so that we can set high standards for how human beings must be treated, because we need to attend to the human needs that express what human rights need to be attended to. We all have the same human rights, but we may need something different based on our intersectional identities to determine what we need from the human rights framework. For example, every child has a human right to an education, but a blind child may need her books in Braille so that she can enjoy the same human rights that the sighted children can. And so that's the dialectical relationship between human needs expressed as human rights protection. But we need these moral standards in our societies because right now there doesn't seem to be a bottom to the floor. And in endless way, people's human rights are not only violated, but they're morally justified to be violated, mainly because of their race or their gender identity or their sexual preference or their citizenship status and so on. So we have to challenge fascism and white supremacy ideologically because it is the ideas of white supremacy and fascism. The thing that I want you to understand is that there is a difference between white supremacy as a body of ideas and an ideology, and whiteness as an identity. Because obviously, not all fascists and white supremacists are white, and not all white people are white supremacists. And it is that conflation of white supremacy, the ideology, with whiteness as an identity that has led a lot of people to feel paralyzed. Because when they see that the human rights movement is critiquing fascism and white supremacy, they feel that they're incriminated simply because they have a white identity. And that's why I'm going to be talking about appropriate whiteness later on. And so we have these competing ideas of fairness, justice, equality, and equity that we are fighting for as human rights activists. And this requires challenging these ideas within our structures that maintain and reinforce these inequalities of fascism and white supremacy. And that, of course, also requires revising our current legal standards and processes that and pivot them towards establishing human rights as the legal regime that we want to guide our societies and enforce the accompanying treaties, conventions, standards, and norms so that we can achieve justiciability and accountability. In other words, so that we can actually use them in our court systems as a way to hold our society as writ large accountable, and as corporations, civil society institutions, and individuals within our societies accountable. And then we also need to do so politically. We need to have human rights infused in our political system so that we have candidates who run for office based on how they're going to protect human rights versus how many immigrants that they're going to put in jail, for example. And we really need to have these conversations and decisions made about our electoral politics based on human rights standards, not on the demagoguery that we are accustomed to seeing from fascists and white supremacy. And socially, we need new standards for meeting human needs and dealing with our human interactions. For example, seeing that food or healthcare or education are human rights, which of course y'all do much better in the UK than we ever do in the States, as acknowledging that people have a human right to education and healthcare. As a matter of fact, the social welfare contract is enforced much better in the UK than it is in the United States. And of course, we need to create an economic system that not only is sustainable, but is inclusive, distributive, and equitable so that everyone is included. We don't need an economic system or to continue this economic system that depends on keeping a certain number of people out of the system so that they can have a depressing effect on wages, like this permanent army of unemployed people that can actually be used to keep wages down. So we need to think about what post-neoliberal capitalist system are we going to have to consider, because I think the COVID pandemic has really proven the global fragility of the democratic systems based on neoliberal capitalism and the issues that need to be fixed within those systems. And then we need to challenge fascism and white supremacy culturally, using our institutions like our schools, universities, religions, media, and civil society organizations so that people can have guideposts to understanding how interdependent we are as human beings, such as COVID has also revealed, and how we need to work towards each other's well-being. And of course, for those of you who aren't aware or have studied fascism, I'll give a brief overview of anti-fascism, which is basically fighting those movements of authoritarianism. Of course, I believe people in the UK have a much more developed analysis of fascism that as opposed to the United States. So anti-fascism, or Antifa, as we say it, or Antifa, as our mispronouncers in the media say it, is any activity that opposes fascism. It's not based on any particular ideology, but it is defined by what it fights. And there's a continuum of anti-fascist activities. Some, like myself, believe in nonviolent responses to fascism, but there are people who also believe in violent responses to fascism. Basically saying that we need to make sure that another Hitler never comes about, et cetera, et cetera. And so the anti-fascist movement is not one movement or one set of strategies, unlike the media in the United States tries to portray it is. And I've often worked with the people at Searchlight magazine that started in the 70s, that's published out of in England, that really congregates all the news about the anti-fascist movement through their investigative journalism. So if you have access to that resource, I highly recommend it. And we do, as anti-fascists, promote acceptance of a diverse multicultural world, and that we oppose those right-wing extremists who reject the diversity of our modern life. And the anti-fascist movement is not necessarily pro-communist or pro-socialist, despite the attacks by the right that they try to claim that the movement is. And we have various campaigns of discrediting or ridiculing fascists, as well as protests, doing cultural work and exposing them. And we're motivated by a wide range of ideologies from the left to the right in the political spectrum. But as I said, most are nonviolent, but some believe in violent clashes. So in the United States, we have Anti-Racist Action, or ARA, and they're famous for Nazi punching, going around and punching Nazis in the face, but we consider that a particularly masculinist expression of anti-fascism, very patriarchal. And obviously, the fascist movement has a long trajectory because it first arose to oppose Mussolini in Italy prior to World War II. But we've learned, much to our regret, that all weakened European democracies can be overtaken by fascists. And this is what we're also experiencing in the United States, that we have a weakened democracy and we have a proto-fascist movement under the leadership of Donald Trump and his Republican enablers in Congress, creating the ground for us to actually have a possible fascist emergence if we don't take strong steps right now to protect this democratic experiment of liberal democracy. And by the way, we've never actually had a perfect democracy, but we have made some promising strides towards one until we had the backlash in the neo-fascist movement. And one of my jobs is to help US anti-fascists understand about this long history in Europe as well as worldwide, because they don't necessarily connect the dots between what is happening in the United States and how closely it resembles Weimar Germany and what risks that we're facing. Now, in order to do this work, we have to understand the distinction between blame versus responsibility, because I feel the conflation of blame versus responsibility confuses people. And the reality is that there's no one alive who is was part of presently constructing the system of white supremacy that we all have to endure. But we all bear responsibility for ending it. And I like to analogize that to purchasing a home. If you just bought a house, even if it's an older house, you can become a proud homeowner who doesn't deal with housing insecurity, and you will enjoy the privileges of owning that home. But the home you just purchased may have rotten plumbing because the plumbing has been neglected by the previous homeowner. So you can't be blamed for the previous homeowner's neglect or failure to fix the plumbing, but you do bear responsibility for fixing it now if you're going to enjoy the privileges of owning that home. And I say that all of us need to understand the distinction between blame and responsibility so that we can get out of the paralysis of blame and understand that we can mutually reinforce each other's responsibility for ending the system of white supremacy and turning it away towards its drive towards neo-fascism into supporting human rights. And this will require us breaking white silences by interrupting casual racism that often invokes white fragility, which I'll be talking about. When we try to talk about the fascism and white supremacy and the components of white supremacy, which are racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, fear of immigrants, ableism, and all those things, it actually creates a, a, a such a strong discomfort that people would rather privilege their comfort over being honest about the nature of the threat that we're dealing with and the weight of responsibilities we have towards ending the, these ideologies or the power of these ideologies to control our society. And people feel sometimes that they get rewards by not, quote, rocking the boat, not being disruptive, and that the best strategy forward is to be complicit and silence. But one of the things we frequently say is that silence is violence. If you know that an injustice is taking place and you remain silent on it, then you are continuing the work of the more obvious white supremacists and fascists. And sometimes we find people so prioritize their comfort that they privilege their perceptions and their images over having really necessary, frank conversations about fighting fascism and white supremacy. And I believe one of the best ways to have these conversations with calling in practices that I'm going to be talking about shortly. When this happens, I think people are misaligned with their values versus their behaviors because people often think that they're much better inside than their behaviors demonstrate outside. And that's called cognitive dissonance. When you think you're a better person, but you're not acting like a better person and taking on those challenges that prove that you have the capacity to do better. And then also, there's in the woke people, and this is a phrase in the States where people talk about degree of consciousness called wokeism, there's a fake humility that actually gets rewarded and approved by other white people when you have these symbolic deferences to people of color, or you do symbolic inclusion without changing the power relationships, or those kinds of things. And you can get rewarded for this performative conduct without making any substantive changes or challenges to fascism and white supremacy. And this is born because a lot of people are afraid of not fitting into their social circles or being exiled from their social milieu. And that's unfortunate, but we need to, of course, challenge that. And mistakenly, a lot of people think because they are friends with people of color, they've had relationships with people of color, that that substitutes for doing the hard work of ending white supremacy, particularly within white communities. And they hide their authenticity. They even start lying to themselves behind these white codes of conduct that privilege niceness over being real and stuff like this. Now, Robin DiAngelo, one of the scholars here in the States, has written a very popular book called White Fragility, and I'm going to do a little discussion of that as I talk about pivoting to appropriate whiteness. What she's teaching is racial literacy, and it emanates from whiteness studies that started in the 1970s and 80s, with some major books being written in the 1990s that talk about how white people need to develop racial stamina in discussing whiteness, and how whiteness serves as a very enriching form of property and benefits that are not made available to non-white people. And so with white supremacy, DiAngelo is teaching white people how to learn about whiteness, how it operates as an economic, legal, and social system. And she seeks to denormalize whiteness in a very therapeutic kind of process that makes whiteness more obvious and less deniable, so that these silences can be broken. Her theories are based on Black feminist theory, like from the Combahee River Collective, et cetera, that always critiques white supremacy in liberal politics and how it operates in neoliberal capitalism. Her sessions tend to take on quite a confessional quality as people work to become, quote, good allies and good white people to break up with solidarity. And it does explore how whiteness shapes people's personalities, because people are socialized into whiteness just like people are socialized into Blackness, are socialized into Indianness, or whatever. No one comes out the womb understanding how the society is going to perceive them and slot them into social roles. So she explores how whiteness shapes people's personalities, behaviors, and customs for the people identified as white. One of the questions or critiques of DiAngelo's work, though, is raises the question of whether or not working at the individual level with white people is sufficient to remove the institutionalization and the structural pervasiveness of white supremacy. And obviously her lectures and her therapeutic processes are not intended or appropriate for intentional racists or supporters of other parts of the white supremacist ideology. It is intended for people who mainly are in the muddled middle, who want to know what they need to do about deconstructing white supremacy and are largely feeling guilty about being white. Her scholarship is also criticized for not including more of the work of Black intellectuals, that she actually, her book is somewhat under-researched in some people's opinion, but that doesn't distract from what it does offer, because she does seek to lessen white resistance to personal change, and we can hope that this will lead to social and institutional change. But I think more problematically, it often, and maybe too often, increases white guilt that stifles action. And I've seen a lot of groups, predominantly white, that end up spending a whole lot of times around developing safe-based guidelines and processes so that they're not made uncomfortable. And that actually ends up replicating the patterns that we're trying to erupt. So I would argue that if you're going to use the work of Robin DiAngelo, the final goal should be to develop white courage. And so appropriate whiteness is a concept that I created in the 1990s that's really about how white people can reclaim their humanity without the politics of domination invited by the ideology of white supremacy. So it's about avoiding white fragility by developing white courage and how to use your white privilege strategically as a way to deconstruct fascism and white supremacy. It also requires the discussing the differences among people who are called white. Matter of fact, in the States, we call it people who are off-white and interrogate why that is. For example, there's so much anti-Semitism in the white supremacist movement globally, but particularly in the States, that we have people who appear white and who believe themselves to be white, but who are also Jewish, being quite surprised at the level of anti-Semitism that they're currently experiencing. And they somehow, I guess, weren't taught that fascism always has anti-Semitism in it. But we need to have a better interrogation of how class affects claims of whiteness and claims of privilege, and how different ethnic issues get invoked, because in the American context, we have always provisionally extended the definition of whiteness to other populations, as long as they committed to buying into white supremacist ideology. For example, when the Irish first came to America, they were not considered white until they abandoned the anti-slavery movement and joined the pro-slavery movement. And that then enabled Irish to be deemed sufficiently white. Anyway, we've got to address this white brainwashing and the historical revisionism that's taking place right now in the United States and perhaps globally. People are arguing that the history of the slave trade and slavery and critical race theory and colonization and settler colonialism should not be discussed, should not be taught. But we've got to share the truth about our country's histories, the good and the bad. And appropriate whiteness requires defining and explaining microaggressions, the slight insults that people of color frequently experience, like "you go to St. Hugh's" kind of thing, and microaffirmations where you create welcoming practices for diverse people coming into your institution, and that we band together to express micro resistance where we fight for the centering of human rights and the centering of inclusion as a value. And I find that there's too little history being taught about white people who have resisted white supremacy and slavery in the past. So we've got to learn the stories of white abolitionists. Abolitionists, of course, are the people who oppose slavery and continue to do the anti-fascist work today in the past. And then, of course, the calling in culture. So appropriate whiteness was born out of my need in the 1990s for recognizing that there needed to be a new practice, because when I was working at the National Anti-Klan Network, and the Klan or the neo-Nazis or the militias or whoever would have a protest or a demonstration in a town, there were always three groups of white people who had three particular responses to this. There'd be the largest group would be the ones who wanted to ignore it, didn't want to call any attention to it, felt that if they ignored it, they would just go away like a bad dream. That would be the largest group. There would be a much smaller group, though, who thought that their job was to confront them in the anti-racist action style. So they would be the ones that would stage confrontations and fights with the neo-Nazis or the Klans, the punch a Nazi strategy, try to ridicule them, humiliate them, overwhelm them. Unfortunately, that was such a problematic strategy because you'd have 200 anti-fascists showing up to beat up on 12 Klansmen. That was not good optics, because then it allowed the white supremacists to develop a narrative that they were the victims of an intolerant left. And then the last set of white people, and these were the ones I most often worked with, were the ones who wanted to show resistance to the white supremacists, to the fascists, but they didn't know what to do. And it's for them that I developed the concept of appropriate whiteness, how to claim a white identity in service to the ending of white supremacy. But I want to start by using Ibram Kendi's formula in his very popular book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. He lays out three, I guess his taxonomy is about three different types of actions that he sees. First of all, you're born white, and regardless of what evidence of genetic diversity proves, because we know whiteness is not an actual scientific category, neither is blackness, but still, your biological future, using this biological determinist analysis, depends on the protection of that whiteness and the lineage privileges and responsibilities that they entail. Kendi defines this as the racist white consciousness. He offers a second part. You're born white, and no matter what you do, you live in a white supremacist environment, so that will always have you embracing, performing, and sustaining white privilege. He calls this the assimilationist stance, but his category of assimilationist is so broad that anybody who preaches the doctrine of assimilation, whether they're white or non-white, can be grouped into this category. And so one of the critiques people offer of Kendi's analysis is that when you use assimilationism as your category, that's such a broad category that could include President Obama and Boris Johnson in the same conversation without understanding the political differences between them. And then the third category is that he claims is that you're born white and your free will can overwrite and challenge whiteness and white supremacy. And you can imagine or reinvent yourself out of whiteness as part of the anti-racist project. And he calls that the appropriate anti-racist stance. Now, my problem with this last definition that he offers is that it makes the same mistake that I offer as a critique of whiteness studies. They do a great analysis of the creation of whiteness and the damage that the white identity can be used for, and how the ideology of white supremacy is so destructive to people and the planet. But at the same time, they always land at that perfectly unlikely place as a solution. because they always say, well, the solution to all of this white supremacy is to teach people who are identified as white how to be less white. And whenever I hear that, it takes my breath away, because how do you change immutable characteristics that you have no control over? And so it's asking people to perform the impossible, learning to be less white, learning to be less of what society defines you as. It's a great ambition, but I think it's very hard to achieve. And that's what makes me think that it's a false solution, because there's no way that I'm going to claim to be less of a woman or less of a Black person or less of an elder, because these are not characteristics that I can actually control. And so why would I think that to do anti-fascist work, people have to figure out a way to be less than who they are as a way of doing the work? It's just it's such an inadequate, underdeveloped analysis. Is very frustrating to me. So I developed the concept of appropriate whiteness as a fourth consciousness and a fourth approach to this problem. You're born human. Let's just accept that first. You are white, representing the diversity of humanity. And you get to choose whether your human identity will be self-determined in the midst of being socially, economically, and biologically constructed as white. You get to claim how you are going to work towards human rights using your white identity as an asset towards the development of a human rights society and world. And this requires not being ashamed of being white or indulging in white guilt or paralysis, but defining yourself in relationship to whiteness. So in fact, you're going to be moving from guilt and anger into action, and stop the navel gazing, because you do not have to be perfect people to do human rights work. So there's this myth that you have to somehow know all the answers and all the right jargon and all the right this before you do the work. No, you need to come as you are, make your mistakes, forgive yourself for your mistakes, and keep on doing the work. And this will require learning about white courage and defining what being proud of being white means to you. What being proud of being being proud of your own ethnic heritage as well. And this is the step of self-determination. And I believe it is always possible to use the advantages of white identity to deconstruct the ideology of white supremacy, not on behalf of people of color in a savior kind of way, but on behalf of creating better white people and a better white community. And so that's strategically using whiteness against white supremacy. And this is where the knowledge of self and practices of self-love become vital to understanding the power that the human rights framework brings to us in this struggle, and the valuing of our human interconnectedness. And this is where we build new authentic relationships across differences. So I think appropriate whiteness is a very powerful framework. And one of my mentors is Shulamith Koenig, and she says that human rights means recognizing the humanity of the other as your own. In other words, like that ancient African philosophy of Ubuntu, I am because we are. I cannot define myself outside of my relationship to those that would be defined as others. So there's positive things we can do. You know, we can understand and explain the relationship between general and systemic fascism, white supremacy, and personal white privilege. We can discuss the meaning of whiteness and its difference from white supremacy in everyday conversations by helping other white people manage their feelings and reactions instead of calling them out for not knowing. And we've got to learn how to constructively navigate these racial conversations. And really, we have an advantage because a lot of people are hungry for the truth, and they don't want to be shamed of feeling, for being white. They're tired of being made guilty for something they had no control over. And you can explain how denial, guilt, defensiveness, ambivalence, pride, and deflections can usually be used to derail conversations on white supremacy. And these are so predictable that they are preventable. And your job is not to try to convince all white people, because obviously there's some who embrace the ideology of white supremacy and have no intention of changing and learning. And what they do is that they profit from the perception of white victimhood and what they call reverse white racism, so that you have the entire Trump movement believing that white people are the victims, people of color and immigrants and Muslims and Asians and Native Americans and Latinos, which is all just projection and lies, because their job, but their goal is to de-victimize the actual victims of white supremacy so that they can claim, first of all, that they're the real victims, and secondly, they have no responsibility for the harms that they have committed in the past or in the present. And so you can explain how and why white supremacy originated as a positive action, and show people how you can get the joy and happiness and positivity from working within an appropriate human rights-based white identity. And so I'm closing. I want to talk about our processes. I've talked about what the situation is that we're dealing with, what a possibility of appropriate whiteness can be in addressing this. And now I want to talk about the process of how we can get along better. And I call that the calling in continuum. I just finished writing a book called Calling In, the Calling Out Culture. Now, we all know what calling out is, and that's publicly shaming and blaming people for things that we disagree with, that they've said, that they act out on, or what they do. And so we see it all the time on our social media feeds. As a matter of fact, social media is the perfect platform to publicly embarrass and shame people for things you disagree with. The next step, or an intermediate step, is called calling on. Calling on is that option that you have when you're not sure if you want to call the person out, because that will require an investment of your time or energy. And if you're not sure whether you want to call them in, because that also will require an investment of your time and energy. So calling in is kind of like that pause and assessment step. And my favorite calling on. And my favorite calling on sentence is to look the person dead in their eye and ask, I beg your pardon, and just let that lay there while they revisit in their heads the words that just came out of their mouths. Or you can say, I'm not sure what about me makes you want to say that to me. Can you tell me more? That's also an invitation to a conversation instead of an invitation to a fight. And depending on how they respond to that invitation to be told more, you can decide then whether you want to call them out or calling them in. Now, calling in is basically a call out done with love and respect instead of anger, blaming, and punishment. And so you're still going to seek accountability. By the way, all three of these are accountability processes. But for calling in, you want to hold people accountable for the harm that they do, but at the same time, not replicate the prison industrial complex with the punishment, exiling, and shame practices. And so basically calling out is criticizing other people's social justice practices while not being critical of their own, weaponizing our knowledges against each other, our radical language against each other, banishing people because we think that we're in a woke competition, that they are not conscious enough about the same words or the politics or the gender pronouns or whatever that you know. And it really is a way of using social activism to boost one's ego or standing in the community. There's a lot of virtue signaling through calling out. There's a lot of proving that I know something that you don't know in calling out, and that you are somehow part of the enemy. If you don't know what I know, and I know the one right way to do this political activism and you don't, and there's this mistaken belief that somehow to do human rights work, we're supposed to have political purity of opinions. And if people don't perfectly align with us, agree with them, then we're supposed to shame and bully them to make them do so. Now, there's a reason that the cancel and call out culture is being criticized so much by the fascist and neo-fascist and white supremacist movement now, because Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's a wonderful writer and analyst, points out that any sober assessment of this history must conclude that the present objections to cancel culture are not so much concerned with the weapon, because the right wing has always canceled people they didn't like. So it's not about the weapon, but as the kind of people who now seek to wield it. Until recently, cancellation flowed exclusively downward from the powerful to the powerless. But now, in this era of fallen gatekeepers, where anyone with a Twitter handle or a Facebook account can be a publisher, banishment has been ostensibly democratized. And that's why the call out cancel culture is being so criticized by the neo fascist white supremacist movement now, because they had no problem when they were the only ones able to punch down. They have problems when the previous victims are punching back. And there are appropriate uses of the call out, to address power disparities or the inaccessibility of people who commit human rights violations. If you want to stop harm, it's a good use of calling out. If you want to find other people experience that harm or build community with them, that's a good use of the call out. It can also be used to spread information and identify things that are invisible or unmarked that cause harm, and lift the voices of those previously silent. And it certainly is cathartic. It's great for releasing pent up outrage. And there are times, however rare, that public shaming works. So I'm going to conclude in talking about some of the problems with the call out cancel culture, though. First of all, there's a presumption of guilt. There's not a presumption of innocence. So, for example, somebody might say, Joe said something that was racist at the meeting. And then this quickly gets so abstracted that the next time somebody says something about Joe, it goes from Joe said something was racist to Joe is a racist. And this takes on a very pseudo-moralistic, pseudo-intellectual uh, property, so that people who are making this declaration about Joe assume that they have the moral high ground to make this condemnation of Joe. And that's whole analysis rests on a system of false binaries of good, bad, straight, gay, right, wrong, that we have to fight these false binaries in the human rights movement. And of course, once somebody says Joe said something racist and Joe is a racist, then this culture of unforgivability is attached to Joe, because forever Joe will be seen as a racist. And even if Joe wants to make an apology for what they've done, their apology will be read as insincere and they're trying to game the system. And if Joe says, well, I don't think I said something racist, so I'm not going to apologize, then they're going to be read as trying to escape accountability. And so then Joe is a victim of what we call contamination and infection. If anybody tries to defend Joe or hang out with Joe or cite Joe's work or say anything supportive of Joe, then obviously you must be a racist too. And so this is some of the damages of the call out culture. And since I'm running out of time, I'm going to go through my last two slides this way. So what we want to do is avoid that kind of escalation and talk about calling in. Calling in is, as I said, a call out done with radical love to achieve accountability by giving each other the benefit of the doubt, that we work to acknowledge that diverse people really are on the same team and they're supposed to have differences of opinion. And you need to remember the broader context. One of the unfortunate things about social media right now is that people can unearth something someone said a long time ago when they were more stupid then than they are now, and use it as a gotcha moment. Like you may have said something racist or homophobic in the past, and someone catches a screenshot of that unfortunate occurrence. And instead of stopping to ask, well, if that person thought that then, what do they think now? You use it as a weapon to attack that person because, again, because they said it in the past, it's both seen as unforgettable and unforgivable. And it requires that we use these active, loving listening practices and being grateful for the opportunity to be better together, to have our opportunity to practice anti-fascist work and appropriate whiteness. And so it begins with a self-assessment. You have to analyze how you feel and why you want to call people in, because if you're not in a good and healthy place for calling people in, if you're still bleeding from the wounds of a microaggression or an outright racist act, for example, if you're still bleeding, your attempt to call in is going to bleed all over the person you're trying to call in or out. And so you've got to make sure that you're in a healed enough space for a difficult conversation. And you really have to let go of the expectation that you don't have the power to change other people. You don't have that magical power to change other people, because if you did, couples wouldn't fight, partners wouldn't fight, families wouldn't fight, co-workers and students wouldn't fight each other. We don't have that power, but we do have the power to offer people grace, respect, and love, and help them learn other ways of seeing a situation if we do so with respect, and really keep in mind that you have to act towards other people as if you're holding their heart in your hand and you don't want to squeeze it too tight. And even if you still disagree, again, that's okay, because we're supposed to have different opinions, but all calling in practices start with self-forgiveness. If you cannot forgive yourself for the mistakes that you've made, then it's likely that you won't be able to forgive others. So in my online trainings that I offer, and they're every Tuesday night, by the way, if you want to check them out on my website for $5 per lecture. Anyway, in my online trainings, the first question I ask people is, when you were a child and you made a mistake, how were your mistakes handled? Were you shamed and punished for making a mistake? Because that probably predicts that you think others should be shamed and punished when they make mistakes. But if you were counseled when you made a mistake, when you were shown how to learn from your mistake, and when you were forgiven for making that mistake, that probably predisposes you to forgive others for making a mistake. So all of these lessons that I'm offering in appropriate whiteness, in fighting fascism, and in learning how to call people in, start with yourself. Learning to forgive yourself for your mistakes, learning to embrace your fear as a pathway to courage in fighting white supremacy and fascism, and acknowledging that we're all going to make mistakes, and that's okay, because all human rights work is just a big experiment anyway. And we'll get there by being stronger together. I'm going to stop to share. I went a few minutes over time. And David, thank you. If you would have people do the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Loretta. I'm sure it's always very strange on these Zoom formats when we cannot have the kind of applause that your wonderful talk to us this evening really merits. But I'm sure I speak for all of our community here at St. Hugh's, at Oxford, and indeed beyond, by thanking you for that talk. We have a question, and just to note that people can post their questions in the Q&A box, and that we'll get through as many as we can. We have a question for you, first of all, actually by one of our own graduates and an honorary fellow here, Patrice Wellesley Cole, who says, "Thank you very much for your insightful and inspiring talk. I'm a Black female human rights advocate in London, a St. Hugh's graduate, a lawyer, a former judge, an honorary fellow of this college. Here, judges, lawyers, and many professionals are bullied, they suffer racism and harassment at work. And Patrice is interested in what you said about white courage, and notes that people feel excluded from social circles, that they want to be good allies, but people are driven by fear to support white supremacist or racist positions. I just wanted to talk about how we develop white courage in a more positive context.
Well, it's probably wrong of me to call it white courage, because courage is courage. Courage doesn't come in any particular color or anything. But I'm saying that we need to recognize that we're all afraid. We live in a context that's supposed to make us afraid, and it does a very good job of that. But you can't let your fear stop you from doing the right thing. That's courage. Courage is not having fear. Courage is doing things even if you are afraid. And that's just a timeless universal lesson. And so don't expect not to feel fear, but expect more of yourself in order to work through that fear to do the right thing. That's what I call courage. White courage, Black courage, or however you do it. But white people are so rewarded for staying afraid. That's why I use that term, white courage, because if you stay silent and go along with the system, you'll be supported not only by the system, but by your own family if you don't rock the boat, by your own institution if you don't make waves. And so there's a reward system put in place to reward people for white fear, which also predicts why so many people would rather not challenge their own fear, because that tees them up, possibly getting punished by their own community for not supporting white complicity.
Thank you. We have a question from Suzanne, who says, my reading of Kendi's book did not make me feel I had to be less white in identity, so much as I can use my place to work for anti-racist policies. Did I miss something?
Yeah, you need to put Kendi's book in the context of whiteness studies, because the theory that he replicates in his book comes out of David Roediger's work and the whole field of whiteness studies. So he didn't make any radical departure from what's available, actually in much better places and in much more thoroughly documented places. I love this book Stamped from the Beginning, by the way. I thought that was a tour de force. But I was disappointed in his anti-racist book, because there were much more detailed, better research, better analyzed books around fighting racism and white supremacy than he was able to offer. But if you read it, he does echo that if you want to move from that assimilationist stage into an anti-racist stage, one of the things you need to first fight is your white identity. And I said, and my appropriate whiteness says, instead of fighting your white identity, embrace it and repurpose it so that you don't get led into that guilt paralysis.
Thank you. We have a question from Caro. Thank you so much, Professor Ross, for this fantastic talk. And I should say there's a lot of people commenting in the chat saying thank you so much for what you've been speaking about. Caro asks, could you speak to how white people can participate in calling in, calling out, and calling on without centering themselves and their own perception of a situation over the person who is being discriminated? As in, how can white people avoid getting offended on someone's behalf, but still help to dismantle white supremacy?
Well, again, I want to invite people to visit my website and perhaps sign up for the lectures that I do, where I get to elaborate in more than 45 minutes. But what we've been taught, again, that, see, she asked a question totally out of that be less white framework. How can I lift my voice up and not overspeak people of color not take up the space and not be a savior for people of color. That's all out of that be less white thinking. And that's why I have such a problem with that, because every human being should have the right to lift their voices as they see appropriate. It's not who you are and what you say, it should be judged on what you say. And I just want to switch that, not having one's words or contributions to the movement based on your identity be evaluated or overvaluated or devalued based on identity. I want them to be evaluated based on content, not the identity. I mean, because for example, I get so frustrated as a feminist when a woman says something and it gets poo-pooed and the man turns around and says the same thing, it gets applauded. That's identity listening. And I don't want us to encourage identity listening or speaking up. I think that's a false solution.
Thank you. We have a question from Loretta. She says, thank you for this wonderful lecture. How does the UK respond when most of our history tends towards a story of the UK as abolitionists?
Well, I'm sorry, the UK has the same kind of complicated history as the United States, because you also have a very rich monarchy that profited on the wrongs that the English Empire did, and yet at the same time had, like in any other human process, its own built-in contradiction towards abolitionism. So it's kind of like the United States saying, well, we've got the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, and at the same time maintaining a caste system of slavery. So, I mean, all of our settler colonial states have this contradiction, and all the colonizing states have these contradictions within them. And so we have to own both the good and the bad parts of our history in order to move forward towards a more better present. I mean, as you saw in the insurrection at the US Capitol, we haven't even finished the Civil War here in the States. I mean, the Confederate flag was flown in the US Capitol in January of this year. And so we've never actually resolved the question of whether we're going to be an inclusive democracy or not. I actually think that's the same for the UK.
Yeah. Thank you. We have a question from Nicholas Perkins, who's one of our own fellows here at the college. He says, thank you very much for that thoughtful talk. I have a couple of questions and comments. First, could you give an example of a project that you've been involved in that helped turn around the relationships in a group and lead to positive outcomes? Perhaps I'll let you answer that question first before I give you Nick's second question.
Okay. Well, yes, in the 1990s, when I was doing my anti-Klan, anti-fascist work, I was invited to give a training on anti-racist training to a group of women whose husbands and partners were in the KKK, in the Ku Klux Klan. And it was at this remote mountaintop in Tennessee, as a matter of fact. And in the middle of the training, they interrupted me by telling me two things that they thought were compliments. They told me that I spoke very well for a colored girl. And they asked if I could sing them a Negro spiritual. This was 1992. I thought at least they would be past a minstrel request, you know what I mean? Kind of thing. And it was in that moment that I had to decide where I was gonna have my personal reaction to these insults that they had offered me, or was I gonna stick to my agenda and do my training with them? Because they were there to learn about anti-racism, not for me to call them out for being racist. You see what I'm saying? And so I didn't want to sabotage my own agenda with the call out. And so I thanked them for their awkward and badly worded compliment. And I kept on with the training because that was the outcome that I wanted. And I didn't want to sabotage my own training with a badly timed call out.
Thank you. We've probably only got time for one more question. So rather than pose Nick's question, I'm going to go to the next question, which is from Another former student of ours, Beverly Prevett Goldstein, who says, "Thank you so much. I think in the UK we need to learn to be less Black, but I agree we need to separate being proud of being white and buying into white supremacy. My question: I'm reluctant to call out or call in isolated Black people in white circles, though sometimes I wish to put forward a contradictory point of view."
And if it's honest and authentic, you're afraid to share your truth. So first of all, you'll never learn if you don't put it forward. So you don't even know if it's real or not, if it's right or wrong, or if it contributes or not, if you don't put it forward. And so that again is fear. And again, accept the fact that we all are going to make mistakes. We have this mistaken idea that if we can't be perfect activists, it's better to be silent activists. And that's not true.
Thank you. I can see there are other questions in the chat, and I'm really sorry that we don't have time for them this evening. But I think the fact that we've had so many questions is, again, testament to the thoughtful and provoking and rich nature of the talk that you've given us, Loretta. Thank you so much again. And I think I can now welcome our principal back to close this evening.
Thank y'all.
Thank you so much, Loretta, and indeed to David as well for his idea of inviting you, which I have to say, we have full evidence tonight was completely inspired. That was genuinely one of the most inspiring and challenging moments to everything that is in your head about these issues that I've experienced in a long time, and I'm really grateful. I'm sure it's quite clear from our audience's response as well. It's been a great privilege to listen to you. And in fact, I'd like to listen to you more. I'll be signing up for your sessions as well. But thank you so much. It's been a great privilege to hear your wisdom and also dealing with that real fear that we all have of putting our foot in it constantly and trying to embrace it in a way that we have humility, but accept that we will get it wrong and to approach it fundamentally from the human rights perspective that is universal for our humanity. So many thanks indeed. It's been a great privilege, and I wish all of the individuals, all of our students, all of our alumni and our fellows who are listening this evening a very good evening. And thank you very much again, David and Loretta. I'd also like to express my grateful thanks to Catherine Rainsbury yet again for arranging and producing this. This technology can go spectacularly wrong, as many of us know with COVID. We've all come to hate it but need it, and she has been amazing in the work that she has put into this. So please take care, and all of you stay well and have a great summer. Thank you very much and good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.